25 minus 90i minus 81, because negative 1 times a positive 81. And again, 125 minus 81 will give you 56 minus 90i, which is, that is your answer here. Question with this particular problem? Any question here? If you don't have question, let's take a look at chapter 11. So 11, we go back to a quadratic equation, right? So this is what we have, is solving quadratic quadratic equation by square root property. So this is what we have, is how can we solve your quadratic item here? So this is what we have, is this is the property, ladies and gentlemen. This is the property, which is, again, every time you take a square root on both sides, every time you take a square root on both sides of the equation, there will be two answers for your item. One of them will be positive, one of them will be negative. Okay, that's the property, is every time we take a square root, because the equation, in order for us to be fair, the equation is, if you do it on one side, you have to do it on the other side. Okay, so looking at this thing here, this is what we have, is, let's say we have this item, we have x squared equal to 36, right? So this is what we have, is x squared equal to 36. So how, the question is this, right? The question I ask you is, pick me a number for x when I square them up is equal to 36. And you will probably say 6, right? 6 squared, 6 times 6 is 36, you are right. But do you agree that negative 6 is also an answer, because negative 6 times negative 6 is equal to 36, okay? So again, if you have that, that's your two answers. Your two answers that you can pick is 6 and negative 6, which is, again, this is what we have. Or if you were to use this property tell you this, which is, if I take a square root on the left, I have to take a square root on the right, which is I take a square root on both sides. And again, if I take a square root on both sides, this is what they tell you, is you have two answers here. Okay? You have two answers, one of them positive, one of them is negative. And reminder, the square root and the square, they cancel each other out, right? So again, a square root and a square, they cancel each other out, which is, again, this is the only thing that is new, is they tell you that you have two answers. And again, the plus and the minus, this is just to tell you, the plus and the minus just to tell you that there are two answers, which is there are one positive answer and there is one negative answer, right? So this is all they ask you to do, is this is the only property they tell you, is every time you take a square root on both sides, you take a square root on the left and you take a square root on the right, there will always be two answers. There will always be one positive and there will be one negative. Okay, so let's take a look at this thing here, which is, again, this is the step that I asked you to solve. If you have a square root property, or you have a square, we can solve it this way. Okay, which is, remember last time I told you that every time you see a square, an x squared, we have to factor. So now here come where life is a little bit easier, which is, now if there's a square, we don't need to factor. We can just use the square root property. So looking at this thing here, the first thing we need to do is we need to take a square and x squared by itself. Okay, this is different from a factoring method. Factoring method, you have to set equal to 0. This one here, we have to isolate the x squared term. And then we take a square root on both sides. And then you have to set your equation to be one positive and one negative answer. And then you solve for x. Okay? So let's take a look at this thing here, which is, again, let's say example 1. They ask you solve and check. And let's say A, you have x squared minus 81 equal to 0. And again, let me ask you guys, ladies and gentlemen, if this problem were to be your item before, if you have, I don't have it. I did not do it here. But again, do you agree last time, if you were to have this problem in chapter 6, x squared minus 81, do you agree that this is a perfect, a difference of a perfect square? Meaning again, you have an x squared here and x squared here. Last time we have to factor them out, which is, remember, we factor them out and we say x plus 9, x minus 9. And then we say x plus 9 equal to 0, x minus 9 equal to 0, right? Which is, we know that the two answers, x equal to positive 9 and x equal to negative 9 back then. But if you were to do this now, everybody see, the first thing we have to do is we need to isolate, we need to get x by itself. And to get x by itself, everybody see that we have to move the 81, add the 81 to the other side. And if we add the 81 to the other side, this is what you have, which is we have a x squared equal to 81, which is, again, to solve, we need to take a square root. And if we take a square root on both sides, just remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you take a square root on both sides, you have to have two answers. You have to have a positive and a negative answer. You have to insert that thing in, which is, again, a square root and a square. They cancel each other out, which is, everybody see that I have x equal to 9 and x equal to negative 9. Okay? So again, same idea go, which is, if I have x squared minus 75 equal to 0. Looking at this thing here, this is why in chapter 11 is better than chapter 6. Because chapter 6, in order for you to solve, they have to factor out. Chapter 11, this thing here, this is not a perfect square. The 75 is not a perfect square. If back then we say, oh, there's nothing I can do, Mr. Tran, there's no answer, right? But now we are better. We advance. We can find the answer now. Which is, again, how do I find the answer? The first thing is I need to add the 75 to the other side. And to add the 75 to the other side, this is what I have, which is, again, I have to x squared equal to 75. I need to take a square root. The only thing new is if I take a square root, there are two answers, one positive, one negative, which is now, what is a square root of 75, which is, hopefully you guys see that 75 is 25 times 3 like before, which is, again, what do we have? We have plus or minus 5 square root of 3. Which is now what are my answer? My answer is 5 square root of 3 and negative 5 square root of 3. That's what the plus minus is. One positive and one negative. Okay. So again, now the new idea is every time you take a square root on both sides. Every time you take a square root on both sides, you have two answers, one positive and one negative answer. Okay. So let's take a look at this thing here, which is, again, let's take a look at this item here, which is, again, if you remember what we did was the first thing you need to do is, in order for you to solve, in order for you to take a square root, your x squared have to be by itself. Which is, in this case, the first thing we need to do is we need to add the 70 to the other side, right? And then I need to divide the 6 because my x squared is not by itself, right? So I need to divide by 6 on both sides, which is, everybody see that this is what I have, x squared equal to 12, right? And again, x squared is by itself. Ladies and gentlemen, what have we done? We just manipulate the equation to get x squared by itself. Because without x squared by itself, we cannot do anything, which is, again, as long as we have x squared by itself, everybody see we take a square root on one side, and we take a square root on the other side. What am I missing? Hopefully you say, Mr. Tran, you're missing the plus and the minus, right? Again, every time you take a square root on one side or both sides, you have to have a plus or minus, which is one positive and one negative. Which is, again, 12 is the same as 4 times 3. Why do I use 4? Because 4 is a perfect square, which is, again, you have a plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Which is, again, your answer is just one of them is positive and the other one is negative. Those are your two answers, ladies and gentlemen. And if you remember back then, I told you that if you have an x squared, you always have two answers, right? Rarely, there's some occasion you have one answer. But again, this thing here, you have two answers. Okay? So let's try one more, which is, let's take a look at this thing here. And you will say, wait a minute, Mr. Tran, my x is not square. But looking at this thing here, everybody see that the whole term, the whole item here, which is the x minus a, is raised to the square, right? So again, the x minus a is raised to the square, which is, looking at this thing here, everybody see that I have my square by itself. And if I square by itself, how do I get rid of the square, right? How do I get rid of the square? Everybody see that the square and the square root, or the square root and the square in this case, they cancel each other out. But before I cancel them out, hopefully you guys say, hey, Mr. Tran, yes, I'm missing the plus and a minus symbol, right? You have to have that plus or minus symbol, which is, again, I have x minus a equal to plus or minus 5. And hopefully you guys see that now, what do I have? Which is, again, this is basically that they tell you that you set up them one of them equal to a positive and one of them equal to a negative, which is, again, x minus a equal to 5, x minus a equal to negative 5. I need to add a to the other side, which give me x equal to 13 and x equal to 3. Okay, so again, this is your 2 answer, which is 13. Your 2 answer is 13 and 3. Okay, so again, question with this